The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood silently at the window of her private chambers. Her fingers traced the cold glass while she watched the groundskeepers tend to the gardens below. The vibrant roses that once brought her joy now seemed muted, their colors dulled by the weight of recent events that had shaken the very foundation of the royal family. 3 weeks had passed since the devastating news arrived. Prince William had been conducting his usual royal duties when the call came through his private secretary. The voice on the other end carried news that would forever change their lives. Catherine's younger brother, James Middleton, had been involved in a tragic accident while on a conservation mission in Kenya. The details were sparse, but the outcome was final. James would not be coming home. The palace had immediately gone into crisis management mode. Press releases were carefully crafted, statements were prepared, and the machinery of royal protocol began its familiar dance. But behind the polished doors and gilded walls, 2 people were simply trying to process an unimaginable loss. Catherine had not spoken publicly since receiving the news. Her silence was not defiance or protocol. It was the profound quiet of a sister whose world had been torn apart. William found her there most mornings now, standing at that same window. He understood the weight of grief in a way that few could. The loss of his own mother had taught him that sometimes words were inadequate, that presence mattered more than platitudes. He would join her in these quiet moments, his hand finding hers as they stood together in shared understanding of pain that ran deeper than public duty. The British people had begun to notice the change. Catherine's usual warm appearances at charity events had been replaced by carefully managed public obligations. When she did appear, photographers captured something different in her demeanor, a fragility that made her seem more human, more relatable than the polished princess they were accustomed to seeing. The tabloids speculated endlessly about her absence, creating stories about family drama and royal tensions, but those closest to the situation knew the truth was far simpler and more heartbreaking. James had been Catherine's anchor to her life before royalty. While her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had adapted to their daughter's elevated status with grace, James had remained refreshingly unchanged. He still teased her about her formal speeches, still called her by childhood nicknames, and still treated her like his big sister who happened to marry a prince. His conservation work had taken him around the world, but he always returned with stories and a smile that could light up any room. The conservation project in Kenya had been James's passion project for over 2 years. He had been working with local communities to establish sustainable farming practices that would protect endangered wildlife habitats while providing economic opportunities for residents. His social media had been filled with updates about the progress they were making, photos of the people he was working with, and his characteristic optimistic commentary about making a real difference in the world. On the day of the accident, James had been traveling between villages to check on newly implemented irrigation systems. The road was treacherous during the rainy season, but it was a journey he had made dozens of times before. Local officials later said that a combination of heavy rains and a mechanical failure had caused his vehicle to leave the road. Despite the best efforts of rescue teams and medical personnel flown in from Nairobi, James's injuries were too severe. The news reached Catherine while she was attending a children's literacy event in Birmingham. Her private secretary approached discreetly during a break between activities, and those present later recalled how the color drained from her face as the message was whispered in her ear. She completed her remaining obligations with remarkable composure, but those who knew her well could see the subtle signs of her distress, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the frequent glances toward the exit. William had been in Scotland attending a ceremony for military veterans when he received the call about James. He immediately canceled his remaining engagements and arranged for the royal helicopter to take him back to London. The flight seemed endless as he thought about his wife and the grief she would be experiencing. James had become like a brother to him over the years, someone who treated him as family rather than as a future king, and the loss hit him harder than he had expected. The couple's three children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, had adored their Uncle James. He was the fun uncle who brought them exotic gifts from his travels, who taught them about animals and conservation, and who always had time for their endless questions about the world beyond palace walls. Breaking the news to them had been one of the most difficult conversations William and Catherine had ever had to navigate as parents. George, being the oldest at 11, understood the finality of death, but struggled with the concept of never seeing his uncle again. Charlotte, 9, cried for hours and kept asking when Uncle James would come back from his trip. Louis, at 6, couldn't quite grasp why everyone was sad, but sensed a change in atmosphere around him. The children's grief added another layer of complexity to Catherine's own emotional journey, as she tried to be strong for them while processing her own devastation. The palace staff had watched the royal couple navigate this tragedy with a mixture of admiration and concern. They had seen how William and Catherine supported each other, how they made sure one was always available for the children when the other needed space to grieve, and how they maintained their dignity even in their darkest moments. But they had also noticed the toll it was taking: Catherine's loss of appetite, William's sleepless nights, the way both of them seemed to move through their days with a heaviness that no amount of royal training could disguise. Public appearances became exercises in careful choreography. Catherine would appear for essential events, but her team worked to minimize her exposure while still maintaining her royal duties. When she did appear in public, the British people saw glimpses of raw humanity that made them love her even more. There is something profoundly moving about watching someone who represented the pinnacle of privilege and protocol dealing with the same type of loss that touched ordinary families across the kingdom. The media attention was intense, but notably respectful. Even the most aggressive tabloids seemed to understand that this was a time for compassion rather than sensationalism. Stories focused on James's conservation work, his dedication to making the world better, and the close bond he had shared with his sister. Photographs from family gatherings showed him as a warm, genuine person who had chosen a life of service despite his connections to royalty. Letters and flowers began arriving at palace gates in unprecedented numbers. The British people and supporters from around the world wanted to express their sympathy for Catherine's loss. Many of the letters shared personal stories of sibling loss, creating an unexpected connection between the Princess of Wales and ordinary people who understood her pain. The flowers came from formal arrangements sent by world leaders to simple bouquets from school children who wanted to help the sad princess feel better. Catherine's grief manifested in ways that worried those closest to her. She would disappear for hours, walking the grounds of their various residences, seeking solitude in places where she and James had shared memories. She stopped reading the news, something that had always been part of her daily routine. Most concerning was her withdrawal from activities she had previously enjoyed: her photography, her garden planning, even her exercise routine that had helped her manage stress throughout her royal career. William watched his wife navigate this grief and felt helpless in ways he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. He understood the unique pain of losing someone who had been part of your life since before public scrutiny began, someone who loved you for who you were rather than what you represented. James had been that person for Catherine, and William knew that no amount of royal support or public sympathy could fill that particular void. The couple began attending grief counseling together, something that would have been unthinkable for previous generations of royals, but felt necessary for their own well-being and their ability to parent their children through this tragedy. The sessions helped them understand that grief was not something to be managed or controlled, but something to be experienced and eventually integrated into their lives in a way that honored James's memory while allowing them to continue their important work. Palace advisors struggled with how to handle the situation publicly. There was no protocol for this type of personal loss affecting working royals. They had procedures for state mourning, for royal deaths, for various ceremonial observances, but nothing that addressed how to support family members dealing with private grief while maintaining public duties. The decision was made to be honest about Catherine's need for space, while emphasizing that she would return to her full schedule when she was ready. The turning point came 3 weeks after James's death, when Catherine made an unexpected decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She announced that she wanted to visit Kenya, to see the project James had been working on, to meet the people he had been helping, and to understand the work that had meant so much to him. The trip would be unofficial, private, and focused entirely on honoring her brother's legacy rather than conducting royal business. William supported the idea completely, though the security and logistical challenges were enormous. A private trip to Kenya would require careful coordination with local authorities, extensive security planning, and delicate management of media coverage. But both William and Catherine felt that this journey was essential for her healing process and for their family's ability to find meaning in their loss. The announcement of the Kenya trip created a sensation in the British media. Here was a princess choosing to step away from the safety and comfort of her royal bubble to honor her brother's memory in the place where he had died. The gesture resonated with people in ways that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. It represented something authentically human in an institution often criticized for being out of touch with ordinary emotions and experiences. As preparations began for the Kenya journey, Catherine found herself speaking more about James and their relationship. She shared stories with William about their childhood, about how James had always been the adventurous one who pushed boundaries while she had been more cautious and rule-following. She talked about how proud she had been of his conservation work, how he had found a way to use his privilege and connections to make a genuine difference in the world without seeking attention or credit for his efforts. The children became involved in planning ways to honor their uncle's memory. George, with his natural leadership instincts, suggested they create a scholarship fund for young conservationists. Charlotte wanted to plant a special garden with flowers from all the places Uncle James had visited. Louis, in his 6-year-old wisdom, simply wanted to make sure Uncle James would be remembered as someone who loved animals and made people smile. These conversations helped the family begin processing their grief in a more constructive way. Public interest in the Kenya trip continued to build, but there was something different about this media attention. Rather than the usual speculation about fashion choices or diplomatic implications, coverage focused on themes of loss, healing, and service. James's story became widely known for the first time, and people began to understand why his death had affected Catherine so profoundly. He wasn't just a royal brother-in-law who had died tragically. He was a dedicated conservationist who had been making a real difference in the world. The date for the Kenya departure was set for 2 weeks after the announcement. Catherine would travel with a small security detail and a minimal staff, staying in simple accommodations near the conservation project site. William would remain in London with the children, though he had insisted on having emergency protocols in place in case Catherine needed him to join her. The trip was planned for 5 days, enough time for Catherine to see James's work and meet the people he had been helping without creating an extended absence from her royal duties. As the departure date approached, Catherine began emerging from the deepest phase of her grief. She started taking short walks with William again, began reading bedtime stories to the children, and even smiled genuinely during a brief public appearance at a local charity event. The anticipation of the Kenya trip seemed to be providing her with a sense of purpose and connection to her brother that helped her begin moving forward while still honoring her loss. The last few days before departure were filled with final preparations, security briefings, and emotional conversations with family members. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol, had been devastated by James's death, but had drawn strength from watching their daughter handle her grief with such grace. They supported her decision to make the Kenya trip, understanding that she needed to see his work firsthand to begin processing her loss and finding ways to continue his legacy. On the evening before her departure, Catherine and William walked together through the gardens at Kensington Palace, talking quietly about what she hoped to accomplish in Kenya and how the trip might help her heal. The conversation was private, but palace staff noted that it was the longest they had seen the couple walk and talked together since receiving the news about James. There was something hopeful about the image they presented. Two people supporting each other through an unimaginable loss, and finding ways to honor someone they had loved deeply. The aircraft touched down at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, just as the African sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that James had often described in his letters home. Catherine gazed out the small window of the private jet, seeing the landscape her brother had fallen in love with, the place where he had chosen to dedicate his final years to making a difference. The sight filled her with a mixture of anticipation and profound sadness. Unlike her usual royal arrivals with red carpets, honor guards, and carefully orchestrated ceremonies, Catherine stepped off the plane to meet only a small group of local officials and the British High Commissioner. She had specifically requested minimal fanfare, wanting this journey to be about understanding James's work rather than conducting royal business. The humid African air enveloped her as she walked across the tarmac, carrying only a simple overnight bag and wearing practical clothing suitable for the rural areas she would be visiting. Dr. Samuel Mwangi, the lead coordinator of James's conservation project, waited beside a dusty Land Rover that looked nothing like the luxury vehicles Catherine typically traveled in. A tall, soft-spoken man with gentle eyes and calloused hands. Dr. Mwangi had worked closely with James for 2 years and had been with him just hours before the accident. When Catherine approached, he took her hands in his and spoke words that would stay with her forever. "Your brother saved our community. We will show you how, and we will show you why his spirit lives on in everything we do here." The drive for Nairobi took 4 hours through increasingly rural terrain. Catherine sat in the front passenger seat, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to small towns to vast open countryside dotted with traditional villages. Dr. Mwangi spoke quietly about the region's challenges: prolonged droughts, crop failures, conflicts between farmers and wildlife, young people leaving for cities because they saw no future in rural life. He explained how James had arrived not as a wealthy foreigner with quick solutions, but as someone willing to listen, learn, and work alongside local people to develop sustainable answers. As they drove, Dr. Mwangi shared stories that revealed aspects of James's character that even Catherine hadn't fully known. He told her about how James had spent his first month in Kenya doing nothing but listening, sitting with village elders, working alongside farmers, learning traditional farming techniques that had sustained communities for generations. Rather than imposing Western ideas about conservation, James had sought to understand how people and wildlife had coexisted for centuries and how modern pressures had disrupted that balance. The first village they visited had been transformed by James's work. What had once been struggling farmland, dependent on unreliable rainfall, now featured innovative irrigation systems that used minimal water while maximizing crop yields. Solar panels powered water pumps that James had helped design and install. Most importantly, the farming techniques incorporated wildlife corridors that allowed elephants and other large animals to move through the area without destroying crops, eliminating the human-wildlife conflict that had plagued the region for decades. Catherine met Grace Wanjiku, a widow with 4 children who had become one of James's closest collaborators. Grace spoke excellent English and had served as a liaison between James and other community members, particularly the women who did much of the actual farming work. Through Grace, Catherine learned that James had spent countless hours learning Kikuyu phrases, insisting on communicating directly with people rather than always relying on translators. Grace laughed as she remembered James's pronunciation attempts, but she spoke with deep emotion about how much it had meant to her community that this young man from England cared enough to learn their language. The irrigation project that James had been inspecting on the day of his accident was pointed out to Catherine from a hillside overlooking the valley. The neat rows of crops stretching across the landscape represented months of careful planning, community meetings, and collaborative problem-solving. Grace explained that the system was designed to be completely maintained by local people using materials and expertise available within the community. James had been adamant that sustainability meant not just environmental balance, but also economic and social independence for the communities he worked with. That evening, Catherine stayed in a modest guest house where James had lived during his time in the village. His room had been left largely unchanged, and, with permission from Dr. Mwangi, she spent time among his belongings. She found journals filled with detailed observations about farming techniques, sketches of irrigation designs, and personal reflections about the people he was working with. One entry, written just 2 weeks before his death, read, "Finally, understand what Dad meant about finding work that feeds your soul. Every morning here feels like Christmas morning when I was 8 years old, full of possibility and genuine excitement about what the day might bring." The journals revealed a side of James that Catherine had glimpsed, but never fully appreciated. While she had always known him as her optimistic, adventure-seeking younger brother, these pages showed a thoughtful, dedicated professional who had found his true calling in conservation work. He wrote extensively about the farmers he worked with, describing their expertise, their challenges, and their hopes for their children's futures. He documented traditional farming wisdom that he felt the Western world had forgotten, and he outlined plans for expanding the project to other regions facing similar challenges. Catherine found letters James had written, but never sent, drafts of correspondence to potential funders, detailed proposals for expanding the project, and personal letters to family members describing his work. In one unsent letter to her, he had written, "Kate, I think I finally understand what you mean about service and duty. You found your calling in representing our country and supporting causes that matter. I found mine here, working with people who are solving problems that most of the world doesn't even know exist. We're both trying to make things better, just in very different ways." The second day in Kenya brought Catherine to the scene of James's accident. The road was indeed treacherous, a narrow dirt track that wound through hilly terrain with steep drops on one side. Local officials had placed a small memorial at the site, just a simple stone marker with James's name and dates. Dr. Mwangi explained that the community had insisted on creating the memorial, not because he was connected to British royalty, but because he had been their friend and partner in work they believed would benefit their grandchildren. Standing at the memorial site, Catherine experienced the profound silence that would later be captured in photographs that moved the world. For nearly 10 minutes, she stood motionless, her eyes closed, while Dr. Mwangi and the small security detail maintained a respectful distance. A photographer from a local newspaper, who had been following the visit at a distance, captured the image that would become iconic. Catherine alone with her grief, surrounded by the African landscape that had claimed her brother's life but had also given his final years meaning and purpose. The silence was broken when a group of local children approached. They had walked several miles from their village to meet James's sister, carrying a carefully crafted wooden elephant that their community had made as a gift. The children spoke no English, but they understood loss and wanted to offer comfort in the universal language of kindness. Catherine accepted the gift with tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, the photographer captured another image that would resonate around the world. The Princess of Wales crying openly, being comforted by children who had nothing to offer but their pure, innocent compassion. Dr. Mwangi later explained that the elephant was deeply symbolic in their culture, representing memory, family bonds, and the passage of wisdom from one generation to the next. The children had spent weeks carving the small figurine, wanting to give James's sister something that would help her remember that her brother had become part of their community's story, that his memory would be preserved alongside their own ancestors who had worked to protect the land and its creatures. The third day involved visiting 3 other villages where James had been developing similar projects. Each community had progressed at different stages, but all showed the same careful balance of innovation and tradition that had characterized James's approach. Catherine saw solar-powered grain mills that allowed communities to process their crops locally rather than traveling long distances to markets. She observed tree planting initiatives that provided fruit, timber, and soil stabilization while creating habitats for wildlife. Most impressively, She met young people who were staying in their villages rather than migrating to cities because they could see sustainable economic opportunities in their home communities. In the village of Kiambu, Catherine met Daniel Kamani, a 22-year-old who had been planning to leave for Nairobi to look for work when James arrived. Daniel had become fascinated by the conservation techniques James was teaching and had decided to stay to help implement them. Now, 2 years later, Daniel was leading his own small team of young farmers and was being trained to expand the project to neighboring communities. His English was limited, but his enthusiasm was unlimited as he showed Catherine the nursery where they were growing indigenous trees and the composting system that had dramatically improved soil quality. The emotional impact of seeing James's work in action was overwhelming for Catherine. Each community she visited had stories about how the projects had changed their lives. Farmers who could now reliably feed their families, children who no longer had to walk miles for water, wildlife that was returning to areas where it had been absent for years. But more than the practical improvements, she was struck by the sense of hope and empowerment that seemed to characterize every person she met. They weren't passive recipients of aid. They were active partners in solutions they had helped develop. On her fourth day, Catherine participated in a community meeting where villagers from all the project sites gathered to discuss future plans. The meeting was conducted primarily in Kikuyu, with Dr. Mwangi providing translation, but Catherine was struck by the passionate, detailed discussions about water management, crop rotation, and wildlife protection. These weren't academic debates. They were practical conversations among people whose livelihoods depended on getting these decisions right. She realized that James hadn't just been implementing conservation projects. He had been facilitating a community-driven process that would continue long after any individual volunteer had departed. The meeting concluded with a ceremony honoring James's memory and welcoming Catherine as a friend of the community. Village elders spoke about the tradition of honoring those who had worked for the benefit of future generations, explaining that James's name would be remembered alongside community leaders who had guided their ancestors through previous challenges. They presented Catherine with a traditional Kikuyu shawl that had been worn by women leaders in their culture, explaining that she was now considered a daughter of their community and would always be welcome among them. That evening, Catherine had dinner with Grace Wanjiku's family in their modest home. The meal was simple, ugali, sukuma wiki, and chai, but the conversation was rich with stories about James's time among them. Grace's children, who had called James uncle despite no blood relation, shared memories of his terrible Kikuyu pronunciation, his inability to milk cows properly, and his genuine excitement when he successfully harvested his first crop of maize. Through their laughter and tears, Catherine began to see a picture of her brother that was both familiar and new. Still the enthusiastic, kind person she had always known, but also a dedicated professional who had found his true calling. The children showed Catherine a small garden James had helped them plant, where they were growing vegetables to supplement their family's nutrition and income. Grace explained that James had been particularly interested in teaching sustainable gardening techniques that could be replicated by other families without requiring expensive inputs. The garden was thriving, and Grace's youngest daughter proudly showed Catherine the tomatoes and kale that were almost ready for harvest. This simple garden represented everything James had believed in: practical solutions, community empowerment, and environmental sustainability working together. As her time in Kenya drew to a close, Catherine spent her final morning visiting the regional school where James had been developing environmental education programs. Children from several villages attended this school, walking long distances each day for the opportunity to learn. James had worked with teachers to create lessons about conservation, sustainable farming, and environmental protection that connected traditional knowledge with modern scientific understanding. The students performed songs and dances about protecting wildlife and caring for the land, and Catherine realized that James's influence would continue through these children for generations to come. The headmaster, Mr. Peter Mahoro, presented Catherine with a collection of essays the students had written about conservation heroes. Many of the essays were about James, describing him not as a foreign expert, but as a friend who had taught them to see their traditional farming practices as valuable knowledge worth preserving and improving. One 12-year-old girl had written, "Mr. James taught us that our grandparents were scientists who learned how to work with nature instead of fighting against it. Now we know we can be scientists too." On her last evening in Kenya, Catherine stood alone on the same hillside where she had first seen the irrigation project, watching the sunset paint the landscape in colors that reminded her of James's enthusiastic descriptions in his letters home. The valley below was alive with the sounds of a thriving agricultural community. Children playing, animals grazing, farmers finishing their daily work. It was a scene of normal life made possible by innovative solutions and collaborative effort, exactly the kind of work that had given James's life such meaning and purpose. Dr. Mwangi joined her on the hillside, and they stood together in comfortable silence as darkness slowly settled over the valley. Finally, Catherine spoke her first public words since arriving in Kenya. "Now I understand why he loved this place so much. It wasn't just the work he was doing, it was the people he was doing it with. They made him part of their family, and now they've made me part of it too." Dr. Mwangi nodded and replied, "James said many times that he learned more from us than he taught us. But what he gave us was the confidence to believe that our ideas mattered, that we could solve our own problems if we had the right support. That gift will continue long after all of us are gone." The flight back to London gave Catherine time to process everything she had experienced. As the plane carried her away from the landscape where James had found his purpose and met his end, she felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. The sadness of losing her brother would never fully fade, but it was now accompanied by a deep appreciation for the work he had accomplished and the legacy he had left behind. She had witnessed firsthand that his life had made a meaningful difference, that his death was not just a personal tragedy, but a loss to communities who had benefited from his dedication and expertise. During the long flight home, Catherine began drafting notes for a foundation that would continue James's work in Kenya and expand it to other regions facing similar challenges. She envisioned an organization that would honor his approach of partnership rather than charity, of building local capacity rather than creating dependency. The James Middleton Conservation Foundation would be her way of ensuring that her brother's work continued and that other young conservationists would have opportunities to make similar impacts in communities around the world. As the plane prepared for landing at Heathrow, Catherine looked out at the familiar British countryside and felt ready to return to her royal duties with a renewed sense of purpose. James's example had reminded her that service could take many forms, but the most meaningful service came from genuine partnership with others and dedication to work that would benefit future generations. She was returning home with a deeper understanding of her brother, a new connection to a community halfway around the world, and a determination to honor his memory through continued action rather than just continued mourning. William waited at Heathrow Airport in the private terminal, watching through the windows as Catherine's plane taxied toward the gate. 5 days seemed like an eternity when someone you love is processing grief on the other side of the world, and he had spent every day wondering if sending her to Kenya had been the right decision. The children stood beside him, unusually quiet, each holding drawings they had made to welcome their mother home. George had drawn a picture of Uncle James surrounded by elephants and lions. Charlotte had created a colorful garden with flowers from all the places Uncle James helped people, and Louis had simply drawn a big heart with Mummy written in his careful 6-year-old handwriting. When Catherine emerged from the aircraft, William could immediately see that something had fundamentally changed during her time away. The weight of grief that had seemed to crush her spirit for weeks was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a sense of purpose and connection that he hadn't seen since before James's death. She moved with more confidence, her eyes held more light, and when she embraced him and the children, there was a strength in her arms that had been absent during those difficult weeks in London. The drive back to Kensington Palace was filled with Catherine's stories about the communities she had visited, the people she had met, and the incredible work James had been doing in Kenya. The children listened with fascination as she described the villages where their uncle had lived, the conservation projects he had developed, and the families who had become his friends. She showed them the wooden elephant the children in Kenya had given her, explaining how it represented memory and wisdom passed from one generation to the next, and she promised to tell them more stories about their uncle's work over the coming days. That evening, after the children were in bed, William and Catherine sat together in their private sitting room while she shared the full details of her Kenya experience. She described the moment of standing at the accident site, the overwhelming silence that had surrounded her as she tried to process being in the place where James had died. But she also spoke with excitement about the communities he had helped, the sustainable farming techniques he had developed, and the young people who were continuing his work. William listened as his wife transformed from someone overwhelmed by loss into someone inspired by legacy and determined to honor her brother's memory through action. Catherine showed William the journal she had found in James's room, reading passages that revealed the depth of his commitment to conservation work and his love for the communities he served. One entry particularly moved William. "I finally understand what Kate and William go through with their royal duties. The responsibility of knowing that your actions affect people's lives, the importance of showing up even when you don't feel like it, the privilege and burden of having a platform to make a difference. The scale is different, but the principle is the same. We all have to use whatever advantages we've been given to help other people." The couple began planning how to establish the James Middleton Conservation Foundation, discussing how to structure an organization that would honor James's approach while creating sustainable impact. Catherine had returned from Kenya with specific ideas about funding graduate students in conservation, supporting community-based projects that emphasized local leadership, and creating exchange programs that would allow young conservationists from different countries to learn from each other. William was struck by how detailed and thoughtful her planning had become. Grief had evolved into purpose. News of Catherine's return from Kenya spread quickly through British media, accompanied by the powerful photographs taken during her visit. The image of her standing in silent grief at the accident site had been captured by a local photographer and shared with international news organizations. The picture showed Catherine in profile, eyes closed, surrounded by the vast African landscape, embodying a moment of profound personal mourning that resonated with people around the world who had experienced their own losses. Even more impactful was the photograph of Catherine crying while accepting the wooden elephant from Kenyan children. The raw emotion on her face, combined with the innocent kindness of the children offering comfort, created an image that transcended royal protocol and cultural boundaries. People saw not a princess performing her duties, but a sister grieving the loss of someone she loved deeply, finding consolation in the universal human capacity for compassion and connection. The British public's response to these images was unlike anything royal watchers had seen in recent memory. Social media filled with messages of support that went beyond typical royal fanfare to express genuine empathy for Catherine's loss and admiration for her decision to visit the place where James had worked. Many people shared their own stories of losing siblings, of finding meaning in tragedy, of traveling to distant places to understand loved ones who had died. The royal family, often criticized for being out of touch, suddenly seemed profoundly human and relatable. Parliament members from across party lines expressed support for establishing the James Middleton Conservation Foundation, with several offering to help navigate the legal and administrative requirements for creating an international charitable organization. Environmental groups throughout Britain and the Commonwealth reached out to offer partnership opportunities, eager to be associated with conservation work that emphasized community empowerment and sustainable development. The response was so overwhelming that Catherine and William had to hire additional staff just to manage the correspondence and meeting requests. 3 weeks after Catherine's return from Kenya, the royal couple made their first joint public appearance since James's death. They visited an environmental education center in Surrey that worked with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing them with outdoor experiences and conservation training. The visit had been planned before James's accident, but it now carried additional significance as Catherine began connecting her personal loss to her public work in a new way. During the Surrey visit, Catherine spoke publicly about James for the first time since his death. Her words were brief, but powerful. My brother James believed that everyone deserves the chance to connect with nature and to understand their role in protecting our planet. The work you're doing here would have made him incredibly proud, and it reminds me that the best way to honor someone's memory is to continue the work they cared about. Her voice remained steady throughout the statement, though those close enough could see tears in her eyes. The response to Catherine's brief speech was immediate and emotional. Staff members at the Education Center later said they had never seen visitors so moved by a royal appearance. Several young people approached Catherine directly, sharing their own stories of loss and their interests in conservation work. One 17-year-old girl told Catherine that her grandfather had taught her to love nature before he died, and that she planned to study environmental science to continue his legacy. The parallel was obvious to everyone present, and Catherine spent several extra minutes talking with the girl about her educational goals and career aspirations. William watched his wife throughout the Surrey visit and realized that something profound had shifted in her approach to royal duties. Where she had once been gracious and engaged, she was now personally invested in ways that went beyond protocol. When young people asked about conservation work, she drew on specific examples from James's projects in Kenya. When discussing environmental challenges, she spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed both the problems and potential solutions firsthand. Her grief had become a source of knowledge and passion rather than just pain. The Kenya photographs continued to generate international attention and discussion about grief, service, and the role of public figures in processing personal loss. Mental health organizations used the images to discuss the importance of allowing time and space for grieving, while conservation groups pointed to James's work as an example of how individual commitment could create lasting change. The pictures had transcended their original context to become symbols of human resilience and the possibility of finding meaning in tragedy. Dr. Mwangi flew to London 6 weeks after Catherine's Kenya visit to participate in planning meetings for the James Middleton Conservation Foundation. His presence in the palace created an unusual dynamic: a Kenyan farmer and conservation expert working alongside British aristocracy to honor a young man who had bridged both worlds. Dr. Mwangi brought updates on the project James had started, including news that 2 neighboring communities had requested similar assistance, and that Daniel Kamani had been accepted to a university program in sustainable agriculture. The planning sessions for the foundation revealed the depth of James's impact in Kenya and the potential for expanding his approach to other regions. Dr. Mwangi presented detailed reports on the communities James had worked with, showing improvements in crop yields, family incomes, wildlife populations, and young people staying in rural areas rather than migrating to cities. The data demonstrated that James's focus on partnership and local capacity building had created sustainable changes that would continue without ongoing external support. Catherine insisted that the Foundation's board include equal representation from British conservationists and community leaders from the regions where projects would be implemented. This structure reflected James's belief that effective conservation required genuine partnership rather than Western expertise imposed on developing communities. Dr. Mwangi would serve as the Foundation's Director of Community Partnerships, ensuring that James's collaborative approach would continue to guide all future projects. The first major fundraising event for the Foundation was planned for the anniversary of James's birth, 6 months after his death. Catherine wanted the event to be a celebration of his life and work rather than a somber memorial, emphasizing the ongoing impact of his conservation efforts and the potential for expanding them to benefit other communities. The planning committee included representatives from the Kenyan villages James had worked with, British conservation organizations, and international development agencies interested in supporting community-based environmental projects. As preparations for the Foundation launch continued, Catherine found herself speaking more frequently about James in public settings. During a visit to a London school where children were learning about wildlife conservation, she told stories about her brother's work with students in Kenya, describing how young people on both sides of the world shared similar curiosity about animals and environmental protection. Her ability to connect personal experience with broader themes of education and conservation made her public appearances more compelling and meaningful than they had been before her brother's death. The transformation in Catherine's public presence didn't go unnoticed by royal commentators and the British press. Where she had once been praised for her grace and style, she was now being recognized for her substance and expertise. Environmental journalists began seeking her views on conservation policy. Development experts wanted to discuss community-based approaches to sustainability, and international organizations invited her to speak about the intersection of privilege and service. James's death had given her a platform for issues she cared deeply about. William found himself learning alongside his wife as she developed expertise in areas that had been James's specialty. Together, they studied reports about sustainable development, community empowerment, and conservation finance. William's own interests in environmental protection, which had previously focused on wildlife preservation and climate change, expanded to include the social and economic dimensions that James had emphasized in his work. The couple began to see how their royal platform could support not just awareness of environmental issues, but also practical solutions that empowered local communities. The children became involved in foundation planning in age-appropriate ways. George, now 11, helped design a website section that would allow young people to learn about conservation careers and connect with mentors in environmental fields. Charlotte created artwork for foundation materials, including a logo that incorporated the wooden elephant Catherine had brought back from Kenya. Lewis, at 6, contributed his enthusiasm and countless questions that helped the adults remember to explain complex concepts in simple, accessible language. As the foundation took shape, Catherine realized that James's death had fundamentally changed not just her personal life, but also her understanding of her role as a working royal. The tragedy had connected her to communities and issues in ways that purely ceremonial appearances never could. Her grief had evolved into expertise, her personal loss had become public purpose, and her brother's legacy was creating opportunities for meaningful service that honored both his memory and her own values. The announcement of the James Middleton Conservation Foundation's official launch was accompanied by a detailed report on the project James had completed in Kenya and the plans for expanding similar work to other regions. The report included testimonials from community members in Kenya, data on environmental and economic improvements achieved through James's projects, and projections for the Foundation's potential impact over the next 5 years. Most importantly, it included James's own words from his journals, describing his vision for conservation work that empowered communities while protecting environments. 6 months after James's death, Catherine stood before cameras at Kensington Palace to formally announce the Foundation's launch. She wore a dress made from Kenyan fabric that Dr. Mwangi had brought as a gift from the communities James had worked with, and she spoke with confidence and authority about conservation, development, and the importance of partnership in addressing environmental challenges. The woman who had once been known primarily for her fashion choices and royal appearances was now being recognized as a knowledgeable advocate for issues that could affect the future of the planet. The speech concluded with Catherine's most personal reflection on her brother's legacy. James believed that we all have a responsibility to leave the world better than we found it, and that the most effective way to fulfill that responsibility is by working alongside others who share our commitment to positive change. The foundation we're launching today will honor his memory by continuing his work, but more importantly, it will honor his values by ensuring that the communities we work with are true partners in every project we undertake. James taught me that grief can become purpose, that loss can become legacy, and that the best way to remember someone we love is to continue the work they cared about. The British public had watched Catherine navigate the most difficult period of her adult life with grace, authenticity, and determination. They had seen her transform personal tragedy into public purpose, using her platform to advance causes her brother had died working for. The photographs from Kenya that had initially captured a moment of private grief had become symbols of resilience, service, and the possibility of finding meaning in loss. Through her journey from devastating news to purposeful action, Catherine had shown that even members of the royal family faced the same fundamental human challenges of processing grief and honoring the memory of loved ones who had died too soon. 1 year after James's death, Catherine stood in the same garden at Kensington Palace where she and William had walked the night before her trip to Kenya. The seasons had changed, the gardens had been replanted, and she had been transformed by a year of turning grief into purpose. The James Middleton Conservation Foundation had funded 12 projects across 3 countries, supporting communities in developing sustainable farming practices while protecting wildlife habitats. What had begun as a way to honor her brother's memory had evolved into one of the most successful community-based conservation initiatives in the Commonwealth. The anniversary of James's death was marked not with somber mourning, but with a celebration of life and legacy at the Royal Geographic Society. Representatives from all the communities the foundation had worked with traveled to London for the event, joining British conservationists, government officials, and members of the royal family in recognizing the impact James's work had achieved and the potential for continued expansion. Dr. Mwangi served as the keynote speaker, describing how James's approach to conservation had transformed not just farming practices, but entire community attitudes toward environmental protection and economic development. Grace Wanjiku, the Kenyan widow who had become one of Catherine's closest collaborators in the foundation's work, presented an update on the original project sites. The irrigation systems James had helped design were now being maintained entirely by local communities and had been replicated in 15 neighboring villages. The solar-powered grain mills were processing crops for a regional cooperative that had increased farmer incomes by an average of 60%. Most significantly, the environmental education programs had produced a generation of young people who saw conservation and sustainable development as career opportunities rather than obstacles to economic progress. Daniel Kamani, the young farmer who had decided to stay in his village rather than migrate to Nairobi, had graduated from university with a degree in sustainable agriculture and was now leading the foundation's community partnership program in East Africa. His transformation from potential urban migrant to rural conservation leader embodied everything James had hoped to achieve through his work. During the anniversary event, Daniel announced that he had been accepted to pursue a master's degree in environmental policy at Cambridge University, with plans to return to Kenya to expand sustainable farming techniques across the entire region. Catherine had spent the year developing genuine expertise in conservation and development issues that went far beyond the ceremonial involvement typical of royal patronages. She regularly participated in technical discussions about irrigation design, soil management, and wildlife corridor planning. Her conversations with community leaders, conservation scientists, and development economists had given her knowledge that made her contributions valuable rather than merely symbolic. International organizations began inviting her to participate in policy discussions and strategic planning sessions, recognizing that her involvement brought both genuine understanding and significant public attention to crucial issues. The foundation's success had attracted attention from major international donors and development agencies interested in supporting community-based approaches to conservation. The World Bank had approved a partnership program that would expand the foundation's model to communities in Central America and Southeast Asia, with Catherine serving on the advisory board that would guide project selection and implementation. The United Nations Environment Program had invited the foundation to present its community partnership model at the annual conference, with Catherine scheduled to deliver the keynote address about integrating traditional knowledge with modern conservation science. William had watched his wife's transformation with admiration and growing involvement in the foundation's work. While his primary royal duties focused on mental health, homelessness, and emergency services, he had become increasingly interested in the intersection between environmental protection and social welfare that characterized the Foundation's approach. He began incorporating conservation themes into his own public appearances and had started learning about sustainable development issues that connected to his existing charitable interests. The couple's children had grown up surrounded by conversations about conservation, community empowerment, and their uncle's legacy in ways that shaped their understanding of service and responsibility. George, now 12, had traveled with his parents to visit foundation projects in Wales and Scotland, learning about sustainable farming techniques and wildlife protection in British contexts. He had expressed interest in studying environmental science and had begun developing his own small conservation projects at school and in the palace gardens. Charlotte, at 10, had inherited her uncle's enthusiasm for wildlife and had become the Foundation's unofficial youth ambassador. She had created educational materials about conservation that were used in primary schools throughout Britain, and her artwork had been featured in Foundation publications distributed internationally. Her drawings and stories about animals, farming, and environmental protection reflected a sophisticated understanding of conservation issues that impressed even professional environmentalists who worked with the Foundation. Lewis, now 7, had become fascinated by the engineering aspects of the sustainable farming systems his mother described. He spent hours building irrigation models with his construction toys and asking detailed questions about how solar panels could power water pumps in villages without electricity. His curiosity and technical interest suggested that James's influence might inspire a new generation of conservation engineers and environmental problem solvers. The year had also brought unexpected international recognition for Catherine's conservation work. She had been invited to address the European Parliament about community-based environmental protection, and her speech had influenced policy discussions about development aid and conservation funding throughout the European Union. Environmental organizations in Australia, Canada, and South Africa had reached out to explore partnerships that would bring the Foundation's model to their regions, recognizing that the principles James had developed in Kenya could be adapted to different ecological and cultural contexts. The emotional journey of the past year had been documented by palace photographers and sympathetic journalists who had been granted unusual access to the Foundation's work. The images that emerged told a story of transformation. Catherine learning to operate irrigation equipment in Welsh farming communities, participating in tree planting ceremonies with children in Scottish Highlands, and engaging in detailed technical discussions with conservation scientists and community leaders. These photographs showed the Princess of Wales not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a knowledgeable professional committed to meaningful work. The most powerful image from the anniversary year had been taken during Catherine's second visit to Kenya, 6 months after James's death. She was photographed working alongside Grace Wanjiku in the expanded vegetable garden, her hands covered in soil as she helped plant seedlings that would provide nutrition and income for Grace's family. The contrast with traditional royal imagery was striking. Instead of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and formal presentations, here was a member of the British royal family engaged in actual work that would have direct impact on people's lives. Dr. Mwangi had become not just a professional colleague, but a close family friend, spending holidays at various royal residences and serving as an informal advisor on Catherine's conservation education. His presence in the royal household represented the authentic international partnerships that James had valued, and his friendship with the family helped ensure that the Foundation's work remained grounded in the community-based principles that had guided James's approach to conservation. The anniversary commemoration included the unveiling of a memorial garden at Kensington Palace designed to reflect the principles James had believed in. Rather than a traditional formal garden, the space featured plants native to Britain growing alongside species from Kenya and other regions where the Foundation worked. The garden was designed to be completely sustainable, using rainwater collection, composting, and natural pest control methods that demonstrated conservation techniques in an urban setting. School groups regularly visited to learn about sustainable gardening and global conservation issues. Catherine's speech at the anniversary event reflected on the year of transformation that had begun with devastating loss and evolved into meaningful purpose. She spoke about learning to honor James's memory through action rather than mourning, about discovering that grief could become a source of energy for positive change, and about understanding that the best memorial to someone's life was continuing the work they had cared about most passionately. Her words resonated not just with conservation professionals, but with anyone who had experienced significant loss and wondered how to transform pain into purpose. The British public had witnessed Catherine's journey from private grief to public expertise with growing admiration and respect. Opinion polls showed that her conservation work had significantly increased public support for environmental protection and international development aid. Young people, in particular, expressed interest in conservation careers and sustainable development work, citing Catherine's example as inspiration for using privilege and education to address global challenges. The foundation had received thousands of applications from university students interested in internships and research opportunities. Media coverage of the anniversary event focused on the remarkable transformation of the royal family and the British public had witnessed over the past year. Editorial writers noted that Catherine had evolved from being known primarily for her fashion choices and ceremonial appearances to being recognized as a serious advocate for environmental protection and community development. International observers commented that the foundation represented a new model for royal engagement, substantive, technical, and genuinely collaborative rather than merely symbolic. The anniversary also marked the announcement of the foundation's expansion into education, with plans to establish an international program that would bring young conservationists from different countries together for collaborative training and project development. The program would be based at British universities, but would include extended field work in communities around the world, ensuring that the next generation of conservation professionals would understand both the scientific and social dimensions of environmental protection. As the anniversary year concluded, Catherine reflected on how profoundly her understanding of service, duty, and royal responsibility had evolved since James's death. What had once seemed like obligation had become genuine calling, and what had begun as personal tragedy had created opportunities for international impact. The foundation bearing her brother's name had become a vehicle for the kind of meaningful work that had given James's own life such purpose and satisfaction. The most poignant moment of the anniversary commemoration came when Catherine stood once again in silent reflection, this time not at the site of an accident, but in a memorial garden that celebrated ongoing life and growth. The silence was different now, not the stunned quiet of early grief, but the contemplative peace of someone who had found ways to transform loss into legacy. Photographers captured this moment as well, showing a woman who had moved through the deepest sorrow to emerge with greater purpose, stronger convictions, and more meaningful work. As Catherine looked toward the future, she saw years of continued growth for the foundation, expansion of conservation projects to new regions, and development of the next generation of environmental leaders who would understand that the most effective conservation work happened in partnership with local communities. James's legacy was no longer just a memorial to someone who had died too young. It had become a living example of how individual commitment to positive change could create impact that lasted far beyond any single person's lifetime. The nation that had wept over Catherine's heartfelt silent moments of grief had now witnessed her transformation into one of the most effective advocates for environmental protection and community development in the Commonwealth. Her journey from devastating personal loss to purposeful international leadership had shown that even the most privileged members of society faced fundamental human challenges, and that the best response to tragedy was often commitment to continuing the work that had mattered most to those who were lost. Through her year of learning, growing, and serving, Catherine had honored her brother's memory while discovering her own capacity for meaningful contribution to causes that would benefit future generations around the world.